The photograph on the wall of the Coldwater First National Bank was not a flattering one. It had been taken by the security camera above the east entrance, printed on plain copy paper, and taped to the glass door with 2 strips of masking tape. The image showed a tall man in dusty work clothes, wide shoulders, slightly bent by age, white hair visible beneath the brim of a worn cap. Hands hanging at his sides, with the particular stillness of someone who has spent a lifetime doing physical work and knows how to wait. Beneath the photograph, someone had written in block letters with a red marker, "Banned from premises." Harold Greer stood on the sidewalk outside that door in the early morning light of a Friday in October and read the notice with his name attached to it. He stood the way a man stands when he is looking at something that does not surprise him but disappoints him nonetheless. The way a farmer looks at a sky that has already decided not to rain. He was 72 years old. His hair had gone completely white sometime in his mid-60s, and he had never given it much thought. His hands were large and calloused, the knuckles thickened from decades of work, fence posts, hay bales, frozen water lines in February, the endless physical negotiation between a man and the land he works. His back had begun its slow curve toward the earth, the way backs do when they have carried enough. He wore the same thing he wore every weekday morning: canvas work pants, a flannel shirt, steel-toed boots with the left sole beginning to separate at the toe. He looked at the photograph of himself for a long moment. Then he reached into the front pocket of his shirt, took out his cell phone, an older model. The screen slightly cracked in the upper right corner and dialed a number from memory. It rang twice. "Margaret," he said when the line connected. "Begin the withdrawal. All of it. Transfer everything to Heartland Agricultural Credit Union exactly as we discussed." A pause on the other end. Then, "Harold, are you certain?" "I'm standing outside looking at a picture of myself taped to a bank door," he said. "Yes, I'm certain." He put the phone back in his shirt pocket, turned around, walked back to his truck. Behind him, through the glass door, the morning staff of the Coldwater First National Bank was beginning to arrive for work, unaware that the quiet man in the dusty work clothes who had just walked away from their building had, as of the previous afternoon, become worth $63 million. The town of Cedar Falls sat in the low, flat country of eastern Iowa. The way small towns do not. Dramatically, not with any particular ambition, but with the settled permanence of something that has been in one place long enough to stop justifying itself. Main Street had a hardware store, a diner called Paulette's that opened at 5:30 in the morning and closed at 2 in the afternoon. A post office, a barber shop, 2 churches within sight of each other, and the branch of the Coldwater First National Bank that occupied the corner lot where a feed store had stood for 40 years before the building burned down in 1987. The surrounding country was farmland. Had always been farmland, would always be farmland, though the nature of who owned it and worked it had shifted over the decades in ways that the older residents of Cedar Falls described with a kind of weary precision, which families had sold, which had held, which had been forced out, which had simply faded. Harold Greer had not sold, had not faded, had held. His family had worked that land since his grandfather broke the original ground in 1909, and the 5,200 acres that now bore his name on the county deed records represented 4 generations of people who had stayed when staying was difficult and who had worked when working was the only option available to them. Harold knew every acre of it. He could walk its boundaries from memory, name the low places that flooded in wet springs, identify the particular quality of soil that shifted as you crossed from the north pasture into the eastern fields. He had baled hay on that land as a boy, driven combines on it as a young man, repaired its fences through every decade of his adult life. He had also very quietly chosen not to use the wealth it represented. This was not poverty. Harold Greer was not a poor man. He was a man who had made a deliberate decision, and he had made it 4 years ago in the weeks after the funeral, when he had sat alone in the kitchen of the farmhouse with a cup of coffee gone cold and understood with a particular clarity that grief sometimes provides what mattered and what did not. The accident had happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late March. James Greer had been 39 years old. He had his father's height and his mother's patience, and a laugh that could be heard from 2 rooms away. He had married Carol Whitfield when they were both 26, and they had built a life together in the town of Ames, 40 miles west, James working in agricultural equipment sales. Carol teaching 3rd grade at an elementary school called Hawthorne. They had one child, a daughter named Lily, born when James was 31. The accident occurred on Route 30 westbound in the kind of late March afternoon that looks like winter is finally releasing its grip and tricks you into thinking the roads are safer than they are. The truck that crossed the center line belonged to a man who had fallen asleep at the wheel. James died at the scene. Carol survived the initial impact but died at the hospital 4 hours later. Lily was 4 years old. Harold had driven to Ames that night in the rain and brought her home in the back seat of his truck, buckled into a car seat that belonged to a world that no longer existed. She had fallen asleep somewhere on Route 30 heading east, and Harold had driven the rest of the way listening to her breathe. He brought her inside, put her in the room that had been James's room, sat in the kitchen until the sun came up, and he made a decision. James had said it to him once, not long before the accident, during one of those ordinary conversations between a father and son that seem unremarkable at the time and become everything afterward. They had been standing in the north pasture looking at the land, and Harold had been talking about the offers that were starting to come in from development companies. James had shaken his head slowly. "Dad," he had said, "don't let money be the thing she remembers most about you." Harold had filed that sentence away without understanding at the time that he would one day need it the way a man needs a handhold on a steep slope. He understood it now. He kept the land. He kept the deed records in a wooden box beneath a floorboard in the kitchen, a cedar box roughly made sealed at the edges with a strip of rubber weatherproofing put there by his own father in the 1960s and used by Harold since. He kept the correspondence with his attorney, Margaret Holloway, of the Holloway Law Group in Des Moines, who managed the land trust and the associated accounts, and who had over the past 4 years demonstrated a discretion that Harold considered among the most valuable qualities a person could possess. And he went to work every morning before the sun was fully up, because going to work was what he knew how to do, and because Lily needed to see a man who got up before the sun and came home tired and sat down to dinner with clean hands and a clear conscience. He worked at neighboring farms, drove his 2003 Ford F-150, which had 187,000 miles on it and a rattle in the passenger door that he had never bothered to fix. He charged fair rates for honest work. He paid his taxes, his utility bills, his grocery bills. He maintained a checking account at the Coldwater First National Bank, had maintained one there for 22 years, where he kept enough money for ordinary expenses and nothing more. This was the man that Cedar Falls knew. The quiet old farmer with the white hair and the beat-up truck and the little granddaughter he raised alone. This was the only man most of Cedar Falls had ever thought to look for. Lily Greer was 8 years old and had her father's eyes dark brown, watchful, capable of great stillness when she was thinking hard about something. She had Carol's small hands and Carol's habit of tilting her head slightly to the left when she was listening. She had developed in the 4 years since the accident a self-contained quality that her teachers described in parent conferences as maturity, and that Harold recognized as something more complicated, the particular seriousness of a child who has learned early that the world can change without warning. She was also, when she allowed herself to be, genuinely funny. She had a dry, sideways sense of humor that surfaced unexpectedly, and that Harold suspected she had inherited from nobody in particular. It seemed to be entirely her own. She called him Grandpa. Always Grandpa, never a shortened version. She said it with a kind of precision that Harold had come to understand as its own form of affection. Their mornings ran by a routine that had established itself organically in the first months after she came to live with him and had since hardened into something resembling ritual. Harold woke at 4:45. He dressed in the dark boots last laced up at the kitchen table. He started the coffee. He began whatever was on the stove for breakfast, usually oatmeal because Lily ate it without complaint, sometimes eggs on the weekends when there was more time. At 6:15 he went upstairs and knocked twice on her door. At 6:20 she appeared in the kitchen in the clothes she had laid out the night before. She had learned to do this herself without being asked sometime around age 6. and sat at the table with the focused seriousness of someone arriving at a place they have decided to take seriously. They ate together. They did not talk much in the mornings. This was not unfriendliness. It was a shared preference for quiet that had emerged between them naturally, the way compatible habits do between people who live closely and pay attention to each other. At 7, Harold drove her to school. He walked her to the entrance not because she needed it, but because he wanted to see her go through the door. She always turned and waved once before she disappeared inside. He drove to work. He came home at 5. They ate dinner together. This was when they talked about her day, about what she was reading, about the small events of school life that she reported with the careful accuracy of a good witness. After dinner, she did homework at the kitchen table, while he sat in the adjacent chair with whatever book he was working through. Harold read constantly, had read his whole life history mostly, but also biography and occasionally novels. When Margaret recommended one, she thought he wouldn't dismiss too quickly. At 8:30, she went upstairs. At 9, the house was quiet. This was their life. It was not a glamorous life or a dramatic one. It was a life of repetition and steadiness and the small accumulations of daily presence that Harold had come to understand after 72 years on Earth was what most of love actually consisted of. The wooden box beneath the kitchen floorboard held, among other documents, the most recent letter from Margaret, dated 6 weeks earlier. It outlined in the careful language of legal correspondence the final terms of the pending sale agreement with Meridian Agricultural Corporation, a Des Moines-based firm specializing in large-scale sustainable farmland acquisition, 5,200 acres, agreed price $63 million. Closing anticipated within 30 days, pending final title review. Harold had opened the box, perhaps twice a year since James died. Not because he needed to review its contents. He knew them well enough, but because he believed that a man should not forget what he carries. He should look at it directly at regular intervals, the way you look at a weight before you lift it, to make sure you still understand what it is. He had read Margaret's letter twice, folded it back along its original creases, and returned it to the box. He had replaced the floorboard. He had gone upstairs and checked on Lily, who was asleep. He had stood in the hallway outside her door for a moment, listening to the house settle around him in the autumn dark, and thought about James, who had loved this land and who had also understood perhaps more clearly than Harold had at the same age that land is not what a family is made of. People are what a family is made of. The Thursday that changed everything started no differently than any other. Harold made coffee, started the oatmeal. At 6:15 he knocked on Lily's door. She didn't answer. He knocked again, opened the door. She was lying in her bed with the covers pulled up to her chin, and her face flushed a color that told him everything he needed to know before he crossed the room. He put the back of his hand to her forehead. She was burning. "Hurts," she said. Her voice was smaller than usual, scraped thin by the fever. "I know," Harold said. "It's all right." He called the family he was supposed to work for that morning, the Alderson place 3 miles east, where they were finishing the fall harvest, and told them he wouldn't be in. Leland Alderson said it was no trouble not to worry about it, and Harold thanked him and meant it. He spent the day with Lily. He brought her water, changed the cool cloth on her forehead every 20 minutes, gave her the correct dose of children's acetaminophen from the medicine cabinet at the precise intervals the box indicated. He sat in the chair beside her bed and read to her from the book she was currently working through, an illustrated history of the American West that she had chosen from the school library and that she loved with the particular intensity children bring to subjects they have discovered independently. She slept on and off. When she was awake, she watched him with the stillness in her face that meant she was paying attention to something she hadn't yet put into words. Around noon, she said, "Grandpa, you didn't go to work." "No," he said, "because of me, because of you." She thought about this. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," Harold said. "There is nowhere else I would be." She considered him for another moment with that particular careful attention, the way she had of sitting with things before accepting them. Then she nodded and closed her eyes again. He went downstairs in mid-afternoon when her fever broke slightly and she fell into a deeper sleep. He washed the dishes from the morning, checked the mailbox. 3 envelopes, 2 routine. The third was from Coldwater First National Bank standard business envelope, the kind that usually contained account statements or promotional material. Harold opened it at the kitchen table. He read it twice. The letter stated that his checking account had a negative balance of $9.00 as of the previous business day's close. Per the terms of his account agreement, assets associated with the account, including any linked collateral, were subject to procedural review and potential recovery action within 72 hours if the balance was not restored to positive standing. Harold set the letter on the table. $9. He knew with the certainty of a man who tracks his expenses the way farmers track weather that his account had been positive as of Monday. He had deposited his weekly wages from the Alderson farm on Monday afternoon. He had made 2 small purchases since then, a tank of gas and a bag of groceries. The math did not produce a negative balance. It was not possible that he owed this bank $9. But the letter said he did, and the letter said the clock was running. He folded the letter carefully and put it in the front pocket of his work shirt. Went upstairs. Sat with Lily for another 10 minutes, watching the rise and fall of her breathing in the way he had watched it since the night he brought her home from Ames in the rain. Then he went downstairs, put on his coat, and made a decision. He would go to the bank in the morning. He would bring Lily. He was not going to leave her alone while she was sick, and the errand would take 20 minutes. He would bring his account statement. He would explain the discrepancy calmly and pay whatever was actually owed, which he was certain was nothing, and the matter would be resolved. This was how Harold Greer approached problems. Directly, quietly, without drama. The Coldwater First National Bank opened at 8:30 on Friday mornings. Harold arrived at 8:32, having driven the 12 minutes from the farmhouse with Lily, bundled in the passenger seat, still pale from the fever, but alert enough to look out the window at the passing fields. She wore her winter coat over her pajamas because Harold had decided that warmth mattered more than presentation. He parked in the lot, helped Lily down from the truck, took her hand. They walked through the glass door into the lobby. The bank was not busy at this hour. A few customers at the teller windows, a woman filling out a deposit slip at the standing counter, 2 men in work clothes waiting in plastic chairs. The lobby smelled of carpet cleaner and recycled air. The overhead lights were the flat fluorescent kind that made everyone look slightly unwell. Harold approached the reception desk and explained that he needed to speak with someone about a notice he had received regarding his account. The receptionist, a young woman whose name tag read Ashley, told him she would get the branch manager. Harold thanked her. He and Lily stood in the lobby and waited. Lily held his hand and looked around, with the detached curiosity of a child still working at 60% capacity. Preston Caldwell came out of his office 2 minutes later. He was 48 years old, built with the well-fed solidity of a man who had spent 2 decades behind a desk and attended lunches that other people paid for. He wore a navy suit with a pocket square, and his hair was dark and carefully groomed. He had the kind of face that manages authority easily. Not unhandsome, not memorable, the face of a man who had learned that a certain expression of brisk confidence is usually enough to establish the dynamics of any room he enters. He took one look at Harold. The expression shifted. Not dramatically, Caldwell was too experienced for that. But it shifted in the small, practiced ways that people who pay attention can read the slight straightening of posture that was not friendliness, but the preparation for a different kind of engagement, the brief downward assessment of canvas work pants and flannel shirt and worn boots. The fractional delay before the smile arrived. "Can I help you?" Caldwell said. It was not quite a question. Harold explained. He had received a notice. His account appeared to show a $9 deficit. He believed this was an error, but he had come to resolve it either way. He had brought his account records. He reached into his coat pocket for the folded statement. Caldwell did not look at the statement. "Sir," he said, and his voice had taken on a carrying quality. The kind of volume not necessary for a 2-person conversation, but that ensures a lobby of people can hear without appearing to listen. Financial irresponsibility of this kind is exactly the sort of thing that creates problems for everyone involved. An account in negative standing is not a small matter. It reflects a pattern. It reflects an error, Harold said quietly. I have my statement. A pattern, Caldwell continued, of insufficient attention to basic financial management. I'm sure you understand that the bank has obligations and that we cannot simply... Lily's hand tightened on Harold's. He felt the small increased pressure of her fingers against his palm. The grip of a child who has understood that something is wrong but does not know what to do about it. He looked down at her. She was looking up at him, and what he saw in her face was not fear of Caldwell or full comprehension of what was happening. What he saw was something simpler. She was looking at him to see how to feel about all of it. She was 8 years old, and he was the person she used to calibrate the world. He looked back at Caldwell. In the lobby, the ordinary sounds of a bank going about its morning business had subtly diminished. The woman at the standing counter had stopped writing. One of the men in the plastic chairs had shifted to face forward. Ashley at the reception desk was looking at her computer screen with the fixed attention of someone who is not looking at a computer screen. There was one other person whose attention had changed. At the far teller station, a young woman in the bank uniform of navy slacks and a white shirt had turned from her window. Her name badge read, Winifred Oakes. She was 26 years old, and she had been working at this branch for 14 months, and she had a habit inherited from her father, who had spent 30 years as a county auditor, of noticing when numbers did not add up. She was watching Harold with the focused expression of someone who has just registered a discrepancy they cannot yet name. Caldwell, meanwhile, had summoned a security guard, a heavy-set man named Darnell Fitch, who emerged from a door near the back of the lobby with the careful posture of someone who prefers not to be involved in situations like this but has been called and has no choice. I'm going to have to ask you to leave, Caldwell said. His voice had returned to its normal volume. You're disrupting the normal operation of... I have $9 in my coat pocket, Harold said. His voice was perfectly even. I came here to pay what the letter says I owe. If you'll look at my account statement, you'll find... Sir, if you'll look, Harold said again quietly, at my account statement. Caldwell took the statement, looked at it the way you look at something you have already decided is irrelevant, handed it back, nodded at Darnell Fitch. Harold felt Lily press closer against his side, her shoulder against his hip, the same instinctive gesture she had made when she was 4 years old, and the world had become incomprehensible. He put his hand on her shoulder. He looked at Caldwell for one more moment, not with anger, not with the readiness to escalate, with a quiet assessment that took in everything and then arrived at a decision. He turned and walked toward the door, Lily close against his side. At the door he paused. He looked down at her. Don't be ashamed of how we look, Lily, he said quietly enough that only she could hear. Be ashamed only of how we treat people. She looked up at him. The stillness in her face resolved into something else, not quite understanding, not quite acceptance, but a kind of receiving the look of a child who knows she has been handed something important and intends to keep it. They walked out through the glass door into the October morning. Behind them in the lobby, the ordinary sounds of the bank resumed: teller windows, keyboards, the door mechanism releasing and catching. Most people returned to what they had been doing. Winifred Oakes did not. She had already turned back to her workstation, but she was not processing the transaction in her queue. She had pulled up Harold Greer's account on her screen. She had caught his name from the exchange, and she was going through the transaction history with the methodical attention her father had instilled in her over years of sitting beside him at the kitchen table while he worked through county ledgers, always saying the same thing when something doesn't add up. You go back to where it started. The account showed a negative balance of $9 as of Wednesday morning's close. But the transaction history was straightforward: a deposit on Monday afternoon, 2 subsequent purchases, a Tuesday closing balance that was clearly positive. The math did not produce what the closing report showed. She looked at the closing report again, then back at the transaction history. The deficit did not exist in the actual transactions. It existed only in the automated closing balance, a figure generated not by any human action but by a batch processing routine that ran during scheduled maintenance windows. She opened the system log for Tuesday night's maintenance, found it in 4 minutes. A batch processing error had applied an automatic debit to a subset of accounts during the Tuesday maintenance window. The debit was not consistent, amounts varied, but the accounts it had targeted were not random. They shared a characteristic in their profile data, an internal designation she had seen before but never questioned. 3 words in the account flag field: low-value rural risk. She counted the affected accounts. 14. Winifred sat back in her chair. She looked at the lobby at the door through which an old man in dusty work clothes had just been escorted out with his 8-year-old granddaughter. She looked at Caldwell's office door, closed now, the blinds drawn. She made a note of what she had found. She saved it. She returned to her customer queue because there were people waiting and the work did not stop. But she did not close the system log. She would come back to it. In the parking lot, Harold helped Lily up into the passenger seat of his truck. He buckled her seatbelt. He walked around to the driver's side and sat down. He did not start the engine immediately. He sat for a moment in the quiet of the truck cab, his hands resting on the wheel, looking out through the windshield at the October sky over Cedar Falls, that particular shade of pale blue that exists in the upper Midwest in autumn, clear and cold, and so wide it seems to go on past the edge of what the eye can follow. Lily was watching him. "Are we okay?" she asked. "We're okay," he said. His phone rang. "Margaret Holloway." He answered. "Harold." Her voice carried the controlled excitement of someone who delivers important news regularly and has learned to moderate it, but who today was having some difficulty with the moderation. "The Meridian Corporation deal closed this morning. Final confirmation just came through. All 5,200 acres, $63 million. The wire transfer is confirmed." Harold was quiet. Outside the truck, a delivery vehicle turned off Main Street into the bank parking lot. Somewhere behind the buildings, a dog was barking at something that had already moved on. "Harold," Margaret said. "Are you there?" "I'm here," he said. A long moment of quiet. "Is Lily's school open on Monday?" he asked. A pause on the other end. Then softly, "Yes, Harold, it is." "Good," he said. "Thank you, Margaret. I'll talk to you next week." He ended the call. Put the phone in his shirt pocket. Looked at Lily, who had heard every word and was waiting with the patience of a child who has learned that some things take a moment to settle before they can be explained. "Grandpa," she said, "what happened?" Harold started the truck. The engine turned over on the second try, the way it always did. "Something got resolved," he said. He backed out of the parking space and drove out of the lot onto Main Street, heading east toward home, past the hardware store and Paulette's diner and the 2 churches and the barber shop, past the edges of town where the buildings gave way to open country and the road straightened out across the flat, wide, quiet land. Lily looked out the passenger window at the passing fields. Harold drove. The October morning continued around them, indifferent, enormous, and absolutely ordinary. As it had been before the phone rang, and as it would go on, being Harold suspected for as long as either of them needed it to. Harold dropped Lily at Bertie Osgood's house at 9:30. Bertie lived a quarter-mile down the road from the Greer farmhouse in a white clapboard house with green shutters that she had maintained for 41 years with the meticulous, unsentimental care of a woman who understands that maintenance is cheaper than repair. She was 68 years old, a widow of 7 years, and she had the kind of face that has been weathered into something better than it started. Not harder exactly, but more defined, the way good wood looks after it has been properly seasoned. She had known Harold since before James was born. She had brought food to the farmhouse the week after the accident. She had watched Lily grow from a silent, bewildered 4-year-old into the serious 8-year-old who now stood on her porch in a winter coat over pajamas with the slightly dazed expression of a child, still recovering from a fever and still processing a morning that had been unusual in ways she hadn't finished cataloging. Bertie looked at Harold over Lily's head. He gave her a look that said later. She gave him a look that said, I know. She took Lily inside and Harold heard the girl's voice shift the moment the door opened, soften, slightly, loosen. become something closer to the ordinary voice of a child, rather than the careful voice she used when she was managing herself. That shift was one of the sounds Harold was most grateful for. The sound of Lily setting down whatever she was carrying for a few hours. He walked back to his truck. He sat in it without starting the engine. He took the closing confirmation from his coat pocket. Margaret had faxed the final paperwork 2 days ago to Theodore Van at the public library, the nearest fax machine Harold used for matters requiring discretion, and Theodore Van being the kind of librarian who received unusual requests without asking unnecessary questions. Harold unfolded the document on the steering wheel. He read it the way he always read important documents, slowly from the beginning, not skipping to the number at the bottom, even though the number was what everyone would consider the point. He read the party names, the legal descriptions of the parcels, the representations and warranties, the closing conditions. He read the wire transfer confirmation attached as Exhibit C. $63 million. He folded the document along its creases and returned it to his coat pocket. He looked out the windshield at the October morning. The fields on either side of Bertie's road were past harvest, the corn cut the stalks broken and brown. A hawk was working the thermals above the eastern tree line, circling with the effortless patience of something that has learned to let the air do the work. He thought about James. This was not unusual. He thought about James most days, not in the consuming, disabling way of early grief, but in the constant, quiet way of someone who has integrated loss into the structure of daily life and carries it the way a healed fracture carries its history, invisibly, completely present in every movement without announcing itself. He thought about the afternoon in the north pasture. The way James had said it, not solemn, not lecturing, just honest. The way James was honest about most things. He thought James would not know what to do with $63 million, either. He thought James would know exactly what to do with it. Harold started the truck. He had unfinished business. The cold water. First National Bank sat on its corner lot in the morning light, looking exactly as it always had. The brick facade, the glass door, the small square of ornamental landscaping along the sidewalk that the bank maintained with the careful, impersonal tidiness of an institution that wants to convey stability without warmth. Harold parked in the lot, turned off the engine, sat for a moment looking at the building, then he got out. He was wearing the same clothes he had worn that morning, the canvas work pants, the flannel shirt, the boots with the separating sole. He had not gone home to change, and he had not considered it. The idea had occurred to him and been set aside in approximately the same moment, the way you set aside options that are irrelevant to the actual question. He walked toward the glass door. Darnell Fitch was at his post near the entrance. He saw Harold coming and stepped forward. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stop there." Harold stopped. Fitch pointed at the door at the sheet of copy paper taped to the glass. The photograph of a white-haired man in dusty work clothes, the red block letters reading, "Banned from premises." Harold looked at the sign. He reached into his coat and withdrew his savings passbook, the small navy-covered booklet stamped with the bank's name in gold letters, documenting 22 years of account history. He held it out. Fitch looked at it, looked at Harold, shook his head. "I don't have the authority to—" "I know," Harold said. "I'm not asking you to do anything." He put the passbook back in his coat. "I just wanted you to see it." He took out his phone, dialed Margaret. She answered on the first ring. "I'm outside," Harold said. "They have a picture of me on the door." "Harold, begin the withdrawal," he said. "All of it. Every account, every dollar. Transfer to Heartland Agricultural Credit Union, the account we set up in August. Do it now, please." A pause. Then, "I'll make the call." Harold put the phone away. He looked at Fitch, whose expression had shifted from professional firmness to something more uncertain, the look of a man who is not sure what he has just witnessed, but suspects it is significant. "You have a good morning," Harold told him. He walked back to his truck and sat in it. From where he was parked, he could see the front door of the bank. He watched the ordinary traffic of a Friday morning in a small Iowa town, a delivery van, 2 pickup trucks, a woman pushing a stroller, a teenager on a bicycle. He watched all of it without particular feeling. He was not angry. He recognized this as perhaps unusual and examined it honestly, the way he had learned over 7 decades to examine his own states rather than simply act from them. What he found was not the absence of anger, but something that had moved past it, or perhaps around it, to a place with fewer sharp edges. What he felt sitting in the parking lot of the Coldwater First National Bank on this Friday morning in October was something closer to clarity. He knew exactly who he was. He knew exactly what he had. He knew exactly what he intended to do with it. And none of those things had changed in the past 3 hours, regardless of what a man in a navy suit had said in a bank lobby with 20 people listening. Inside the bank, Margaret's call was arriving. Rosalind Peck had been working the commercial transaction window at Coldwater First National for 6 years, and in that time she had processed a great many large transactions without significant incident. She was 34 years old, methodical, good at her job, possessed of the composure that comes from years of handling other people's money with complete equanimity. The call from the Des Moines office came through her workstation at 9:47. She read the account number, read the instruction, looked at the balance associated with the account, a trust account she had never handled before linked to a main account she had records of, and then she read the withdrawal amount. She sat very still for approximately 10 seconds. Then she picked up her desk phone and called Preston Caldwell's office. He answered on the third ring with the slightly impatient tone of a man who prefers not to be interrupted before 11. "Mr. Caldwell," Rosalind said, "I have a withdrawal request. I need you to look at it before I can process it." "Rosalind, that's what your supervisor, Mr. Caldwell." Something in her voice communicated the specificity of the situation because he stopped. "What's the amount?" he said. She told him. The silence that followed was 4 seconds long. In the context of a conversation with Preston Caldwell, who was not a man given to significant pauses, 4 seconds was a notable interval. 63. He stopped. "Say that again." She said it again. "Which account?" She read him the account number. She heard his keyboard, heard his breathing change, not dramatically, but she noticed it the way you notice a shift in air pressure before weather arrives. "Don't process anything," he said. "I'm coming out." Caldwell arrived at Rosalind's window in 90 seconds faster than she had ever seen him move. He had brought his reading glasses, which he rarely wore in public, and he put them on now to look at her screen, and the combination of the reading glasses and the speed at which he had arrived gave him an appearance of diminishment of a man suddenly reduced to a more human scale. He looked at the screen for a long time. Then he picked up Rosalind's desk phone and dialed a Chicago number from memory. Arthur Bemis, regional director of the Iowa and Nebraska division, answered his office line at 9:51 with the distracted focus of a man in the middle of something else. "Preston, what is it?" Caldwell told him. Bemis was quiet for a moment. "Which account?" Caldwell read it to him. The sound of a keyboard. A longer pause than the one Caldwell had given Rosalind. The silence of a man reading something carefully rather than processing a shock. "Preston," Bemis said. His voice had changed quieter now, more precise, the way voices become when the speaker has understood something they were not prepared to understand. "How long has this account been with the branch?" Caldwell checked the screen. 22 years. "And the associated trust accounts?" "The same." "Pull the complete account file," Bemis said. "The original application, every service note, every flag, every internal notation. Everything. Don't delete anything. Don't change anything. I want it exactly as it is." "Arthur, pull the file." "Preston, I'm calling you back in 10 minutes. Bemis called back in 8. His voice, when he returned, carried the flatness of a man who has confirmed something he had been hoping not to confirm. "The account holder," Bemis said, "has been flagged 3 times in the past 12 years as low-value rural risk. 2 of those flags were added manually. Do you know who added them?" Caldwell said nothing. "Preston." A pause that was not ambiguous. "Do you know who added them?" "I would need to check." "I already checked," Bemis said. They were added by the branch manager, by you. The first was added 9 years ago, the second 4 years ago, the third 18 months ago. He paused. This man has held accounts at your branch for 22 years. His combined balance across all accounts, including the trust, has qualified him for premium service classification since year 3. He has never been offered premium classification. He has never been contacted about any service his account balance entitled him to. He has been processed every year for 22 years as a low-priority rural account. Another pause, deliberate in its length. And this morning your branch banned him from the building. The lobby outside Rosalind's window continued its normal Friday morning business. Customers at the teller windows. Someone filling out a deposit slip. Caldwell was looking at the floor. "Get him back," Bemis said. "Whatever it takes. Get him back in that building today. And Preston, I want the complete file on my desk in Chicago by Monday morning. I'll be in Cedar Falls by Tuesday." The call ended. Caldwell stood at Rosalind's window a moment longer, his reading glasses still on his face. Then he walked toward the front door. At the far teller window, Winifred Oakes had spent the past hour following the system log, wherever it led. She was not authorized to do this. Her job was to process transactions at her window, to maintain her customer queue, to perform her assigned tasks. Internal audit was the function of people in Des Moines with specific clearances and specific mandates. Winifred had none of these clearances. What she had was her father's instinct to 30 years of county audit work distilled into a single repeating lesson. When you find one number that doesn't add up, you look for the others, and a system log she had opened 2 hours ago and had not been able to close. The batch processing error from Tuesday night's maintenance window had applied erroneous debits to 14 accounts. All 14 carried the internal designation low-value rural risk. The amounts varied, but the pattern was unmistakable. This was not a random software glitch. It was a glitch that had followed a human classification. Someone had sorted these accounts together, and the sorting had made them vulnerable to a shared error. She had gone through all 14. 12 had received notices similar to Harold's. 7 of those 12 had already paid, had paid balances that did not actually exist, that had been generated by software that the bank's systems had recorded as legitimate and processed accordingly. One account had gone further than that. Account ending in 7742. A depositor in Minden, Nebraska. The notice had gone out 4 months ago. The response had been logged. The account had been marked for asset recovery proceedings 3 months ago. She read the outcome notation. She read it again. She sat back in her chair and looked at the lobby ceiling for a moment. Then she opened a new window on her computer and began composing an email to the Internal Audit Department in Des Moines. She wrote with the precision her father had valued. Every step documented, every source cited, every account number included the system logs attached. She looked at the completed email for a moment before sending it. She knew what this meant for her position at this branch. She knew that Caldwell would find out who had sent it. She knew that whatever came of the investigation, the working environment here would not improve for her as a result. She sent the email. Then she closed that window and returned to her customer queue because there were people waiting and work did not stop because you had just done something that frightened you. Outside in the parking lot, Harold's phone rang again. He looked at the screen, a number he didn't recognize relayed through Margaret as a return contact. He let it ring twice before answering. "Mr. Greer." Caldwell's voice was different from the lobby voice, quieter, more careful, each word chosen before being released. "I want to apologize for what happened this morning. I'd like to invite you back inside. We have a private office, and I'd like to discuss—" "Mr. Caldwell," Harold said. "Yes, I'm going to say something to you, and I'd like you to listen to it." A pause. "Of course. This morning I came to your bank with a $9 discrepancy that I believed was an error. I brought my account records. I brought my granddaughter, who is 8 years old and was recovering from a fever because I didn't want to leave her alone at home. I came to resolve a simple matter calmly and correctly." He paused. "You told me in front of everyone in your lobby that I was financially irresponsible. You had me removed from the building. You put a photograph of me on your front door." Caldwell said nothing. "If your respect required $63 million to appear, Mr. Caldwell," Harold said, "then it was never respect at all." He ended the call. He sat in the truck a moment longer. The October sky over Cedar Falls had deepened from the pale blue of early light to something richer, the blue that makes cut cornfields look amber by contrast, a color that had no practical function and asked for nothing in return. Harold had not yet heard the name Roscoe Pruitt. That would come later from Margaret in a call he was not yet expecting. But sitting in the truck, he felt the shape of something he couldn't yet name, a recognition that his situation was not entirely his own. That the circumstances producing a $9 notice sent to an old farmer in Iowa were circumstances capable of producing other notices sent to other people, and that some of those people might not have an attorney or a land trust or $63 million waiting to transform a humiliation into a correctable event. Some of those people might simply be old and alone and without recourse. He started the truck, drove to Bertie Osgood's house because Lily would want lunch and whatever else was happening in the world. Lunch did not wait. Bertie was making grilled cheese sandwiches when Harold came through the door, and Lily was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of apple juice and her library book, looking considerably more alert than she had that morning. The fever had broken. Her color was returning. She looked up at Harold and said, "Bertie says grilled cheese fixes everything." "Bertie's right," Harold said. He sat down. Bertie brought him a sandwich without asking if he wanted one, which was correct, because he was hungry and hadn't eaten since the oatmeal at 6 that morning. He ate. Lily ate. Bertie sat with them and drank her coffee and asked Lily about her book, and for a while the kitchen was full of the ordinary sounds of people sharing a meal in a warm house on a cold October day. After lunch, Lily fell asleep on Bertie's couch, the library book open on her chest. Harold and Bertie sat at the kitchen table. He told her what had happened, not the full account of the land sale and the specific numbers, because that was not information he shared broadly. He told her about the lobby, about Caldwell, about the sign on the door. Bertie listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Did Lily hear it?" she said. "She was there." "Did she understand what happened?" Harold considered. "She understood that someone was unkind." Bertie nodded slowly. "What did you say to her?" Harold told her. Bertie looked at her coffee cup, repeated it quietly to herself. Then, "That's what she should carry." A pause. "What are you going to do?" "I already did it," Harold said. "I moved the accounts." "That's not what I'm asking." He looked at her. "I'm asking what you're going to do," she said for the others. He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm going to find out who they are," he said. Margaret called at 3:15 that afternoon. Harold was back at the farmhouse by then. Lily asleep upstairs in her own bed. The house quiet in the way it was quiet on afternoons when the weather held and the world gave you an hour of stillness you had not planned for. He answered at the kitchen table, his coffee going cold beside him. "The audit request has been filed," Margaret said. "Our office contacted the Iowa Banking Division this morning, independent of whatever internal process the bank has initiated. We have documentation of the account history, the erroneous debit, and the treatment you received." "Good," Harold said. "There's something else." The pause she used when she was being careful about how she said something, not because she was soft with difficult news, but because she believed precision mattered when the news was hard. "Tell me," Harold said. "The system error that generated your notice affected other accounts," she said. 14 accounts in total, all at the same branch, all carrying the same internal designation. Most received notices. Several of them paid balances that didn't actually exist. The bank processed those payments and has not initiated any refund." She paused. "One was taken further." "Tell me," Harold said again. "A man named Roscoe Pruitt, 74 years old. He farmed a small property outside Minden, Nebraska. He received an erroneous notice 4 months ago. He didn't have anyone advising him and didn't have the resources to contest the proceedings that followed. 3 months ago, the proceedings concluded. She stopped. Harold waited. He lost the property, Harold. 40 acres. He'd had it for 30 years. His father had it before him. The bank initiated asset recovery on the basis of an error, and by the time anyone who understood the process looked at it, the deadline had passed. A pause. He's renting a room in Minden. He has a grandson, 12 years old, named Eli. They're managing, but the property is gone. The kitchen was very quiet. Harold sat with it. Not with the 63 million, not with the lobby, not with any of the specific circumstances of his own situation. He sat with the image of a 74-year-old man in a Nebraska town who had worked 40 acres for 30 years, who had not had anyone standing beside him when the notice arrived. He felt something move through him like cold water. Not anger exactly, though anger was part of it. Something older. Something that had been forming in him since the night he brought Lily home in the rain. "Margaret," he said, "find Roscoe Pruitt. Find him today. I want to help him legal, financial, whatever it takes to get that property back, or to make him whole if it can't be recovered, or both. Don't put my name in any of the paperwork." A pause. "Harold, don't put my name in it," he said again quietly. "Just do it." "All right, I will." "And the other 13. Find out what they paid, what they lost, all of it. I want to understand the full picture." "That's going to take time." "Take the time," he said. "Do it right." He ended the call. He sat in the kitchen for a long time after that, watching the afternoon light move across the floor, thinking about men he had never met, who had worked land all their lives, and about the particular quiet dignity of people who ask for nothing and receive nothing and keep going anyway. He thought about James. Don't let money be the thing she remembers most about you. He was beginning to understand that sentence contained more than he had originally thought. That it was not only about Lily and memory and the example a grandfather sets. That it was also about what you do when you have more than you need and the world gives you a clear view of people who have been robbed of what was theirs. He went upstairs and checked on Lily. She was sleeping with the deep, even breathing of a child whose fever has finally released its hold, her face relaxed into genuine rest. The library book was on the nightstand. The room smelled faintly of the eucalyptus oil he put in the humidifier when she was sick. He stood in the doorway and watched her breathe. By evening, Harold's name was on the front page of the Cedar County Ledger's website. He learned this when Bertie called at 6:45, just as he and Lily were finishing dinner, to tell him that someone inside the bank had talked to a reporter, or perhaps the reporter had simply been in the lobby that morning, which was also possible given that the Ledger's office was half a block from the bank. Harold thanked Bertie and told her he would deal with it in the morning. He finished dinner, helped Lily clear the table, sat with her while she did her homework. She had been homesick the day before and had things to catch up on, and read his book in the chair beside her. The kitchen was warm. The evening was quiet. At 8:30, Lily went upstairs. At 9, the house was quiet. Harold sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and thought about what Tuesday would bring when Arthur Bemis arrived from Chicago, and about the investigation that had been set in motion, and about Preston Caldwell, who had spent 22 years deciding that the quiet old farmer with the beat-up truck was not worth the effort of basic decency. He felt no particular satisfaction. What he felt was something more like the tiredness that comes from watching people make the same errors and understanding that you cannot correct most of them, only limit their consequences. He washed his cup. He set his alarm for 4:45. He went to bed. The reporters arrived on Saturday morning. 3. At first, a young woman from the Cedar County Ledger named Catherine Voss, 24 years old, and slightly nervous. A cameraman from the regional television affiliate out of Cedar Rapids, and a freelance journalist who had apparently driven up from Des Moines the previous evening and slept in his car, which Harold considered either admirable or misguided, depending on how you looked at it. By 10 o'clock, there were 5 vehicles parked along the gravel road in front of the farmhouse. Harold stood at the kitchen window and looked at them while he finished his coffee. Lily was at the table behind him, eating oatmeal and reading her library book, tracking the vehicles outside with the same sideways attention she brought to most things she found unusual. Grandpa, she said without looking up. Yes. Are those people here because of the bank? Yes. She turned a page. Are you going to talk to them? No. She nodded and returned her attention to her book. Harold put on his coat and walked out to the fence line where Catherine Voss was standing with a notebook and a recorder. Miss Voss, he said. She looked startled. He knew her name. Mr. Greer. Yes, I was hoping. I appreciate you coming, Harold said. I'm not going to speak on the record. I'm not going to give interviews or make a statement. What happened at the bank was between me and the bank, and whatever comes of it will be handled properly and through the right channels. He looked at the other vehicles, then back at her. I have an 8-year-old girl inside that house who doesn't need cameras in her front yard on a Saturday morning. Catherine Voss looked at her notebook. Then she clicked off her recorder. Yes, sir, she said. Harold nodded. He walked back inside. By noon, the vehicles were gone. Arthur Bemis arrived in Cedar Falls on Tuesday as promised, driving himself from the regional airport in a rental car. Harold noted this. It told him something about how seriously a person is taking a situation, whether they arrange a car service or get behind the wheel and drive through small-town Iowa in October with their own thoughts for company. Bemis was 61 years old. A compact, gray-haired man with the careful posture of someone who had spent a career in rooms where posture matters and had arrived at a point where it was simply how he carried himself. He wore a dark overcoat and no pocket square. He looked like a man who had once been more ambitious and had arrived through whatever combination of experience and consequence at a place of more sober reckoning. They met in Margaret's temporary office in Cedar Falls, a conference room in a law practice on 2nd Street, whose senior partner owed her a professional courtesy. Harold sat across the table from Bemis and listened. Bemis described the investigation, what it had found. The systematic misclassification of accounts, the manual flags added to Harold's profile over 22 years, the erroneous batch processing debit and its effects on 14 accounts across the branch's rural customer base. He described the bank's position and its intention to make full restitution to all affected account holders. Then he described what had happened to Preston Caldwell. Effective Monday morning. Bemis said, Mr. Caldwell is no longer employed by the bank. The termination was immediate and for cause. A disciplinary notice has been circulated to all branch managers in the Iowa and Nebraska division. He paused. I want you to understand that what happened at this branch was not consistent with the values the bank. Mr. Bemis, Harold said. Bemis stopped. I appreciate you coming, Harold said. I appreciate that you drove yourself. I appreciate that you're looking at the other accounts and making them whole. That matters more than anything else in this room. He folded his hands on the table. But I want to say something to you that I'd like you to carry back with you. Bemis said nothing. He was listening. 22 years ago. Harold said, I walked into that branch and opened an account. I was wearing work clothes then too. I drove the same kind of truck I drive now. I looked like what I am, a farmer. And someone at that branch decided on the basis of how I looked and what I appeared to have that I wasn't worth the full consideration your institution was capable of providing. He paused. It turned out I had resources that made the consequences of that decision correctable. But the decision the one made about me and made about Roscoe Pruitt and made about 13 other people in your system, that decision was not about money. It was about who someone thought deserved to be seen. Bemis was very still. The problem wasn't $9, Harold said. It was never $9. It was the 22 years before the $9. The conference room was quiet. Yes, Bemis said. His voice was quieter than it had been. You're right. Harold nodded. That's all I needed to say. He stood. He thanked Margaret. He put on his coat and drove home to make dinner before Lily got off the school bus. The investigation concluded 10 days after the Friday morning at the bank. The findings were specific and documented. Preston Caldwell had engaged in a pattern of discriminatory service classification directed at rural, low-income account holders across more than a decade. He had manually altered account profile designations on multiple occasions without customer notification or regulatory basis. He had created and maintained an internal culture at the Cedar Falls branch in which customers were evaluated by appearance and perceived economic status rather than by account history or policy. The termination was confirmed. The disciplinary record entered into the regulatory database. The Iowa Banking Division opened a separate inquiry. Winifred Oakes received a formal commendation from the Internal Audit Department. She was transferred at her own request to the main office in Des Moines, where she joined the audit team as a junior examiner, a position offered at a salary considerably higher than what she had earned in Cedar Falls. She accepted without hesitation and gave 2 weeks' notice the same day. Before she left, she sent Harold a brief letter through Margaret's office. She did not ask for anything. She did not describe her actions at length or explain her motivations in detail. She wrote only that she had done what she believed was correct, that she hoped he and his granddaughter were well, and that she was grateful to have been working that particular window on that particular morning. Harold read the letter at the kitchen table on an evening in late October, Lily doing homework across from him. He read it once, then set it down on the table, and looked out the window at the dark yard for a moment, just a moment, the way you pause when something lands in a place you hadn't expected it to reach. Then he folded the letter carefully and put it in the cedar box beneath the kitchen floor beside the land deed and the closing confirmation and the letter that had arrived from James's attorney the week after the accident. He considered this company appropriate. The full account of Roscoe Pruitt arrived in pieces over the following 2 weeks, assembled by Margaret from bank records, county documents, and a conversation her paralegal conducted with the landlady of the boarding house in Minden. Roscoe Pruitt was 74 years old. He had farmed 40 acres outside Minden, Nebraska since 1991, land his father had worked before him. Land he had returned to after 20 years of other work elsewhere because it was his family's ground, and that fact mattered to him in the way that certain facts matter to certain people regardless of practical calculation. He grew wheat. He kept a small vegetable garden. He had lived simply and managed adequately for 30 years. His grandson Eli had come to live with him 3 years ago under circumstances that Margaret summarized carefully, and without unnecessary detail. Eli's parents were no longer able to care for him, and Roscoe was the person who had stepped forward. Eli was now 12 years old and in the 7th grade and had, according to the landlady in Minden, very definite opinions about what he wanted to plant in the spring. The erroneous bank notice had arrived 4 months ago. Roscoe had not understood it. He had gone to the branch, a different branch from Harold's, the one in Minden, and been told that the debt was legitimate and the proceedings were standard. He had not had a lawyer. He had not known to ask for one. By the time a legal aid volunteer in Kearney County reviewed the case and identified the error, the recovery deadline had passed. The 40 acres were gone. Margaret had identified the current holder of the property, an agricultural investment group that had acquired it through the recovery proceedings and had at Harold's instruction begun quiet negotiations to repurchase it. She had also, at Harold's instruction, set up a structured financial arrangement for Roscoe, not a gift in the conventional sense, but a funded account with specific provisions that would stabilize his situation, regardless of what happened with the property, designed with enough structure that it could sustain itself over time, rather than simply providing a temporary reprieve. She had told Roscoe when she called him that the assistance was coming from a man who had received a similar letter and had better luck than he had. Roscoe had been quiet for a long time after that. Then he had asked if there was someone he should thank. Margaret had said she would pass the message along. When she told Harold this, he said, "Tell him to spend the gratitude on Eli. That's where it belongs." The letter from Margaret confirming that the repurchase of the 40 acres had been completed arrived on a Thursday afternoon in early November. Harold read it at the kitchen table and then did something he rarely did in the middle of the day. He went outside. He walked to the edge of the yard where the fence line met the old equipment path that ran along the north side of the property, and he stood there in the November cold, looking out at the bare fields. The sky was flat gray, the temperature below 40, the tree line stripped and spare. Nothing was growing. Nothing would grow again until spring. But the ground was there the way ground is always there, indifferent to whether anyone is paying attention to it or not. He thought about 40 acres in Nebraska. He thought about a 12-year-old boy with plans for spring planting. He went back inside and made himself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table and felt something he recognized after a moment as something close to peace. Not the peace of a problem solved, because some of what had been broken could not be fully repaired, and he knew that. But the peace of a man who has done what was in his power to do and has not done it for recognition and does not require recognition in order to know that it was right. He picked up the phone and called Margaret. "The other accounts," he said. "The 13. Are we tracking what they're owed?" "We are," she said. 4 of them have already received refunds from the bank as part of the settlement process. The other 9 are still being worked through. I'm monitoring each one." "Good," Harold said. "If any of them hit complications, legal, procedural, anything, I want to know about it. I'll keep you informed." He thanked her and ended the call. He sat for a while longer with his coffee. Then he got up because Lily would be off the school bus in an hour, and there was dinner to start. 3 weeks after the Friday morning at the bank, 3 weeks and 2 days, Harold drove his truck to Cedar Falls for a cup of coffee at Paulette's. He did this perhaps twice a week on mornings when he had no early work commitment. He sat at the counter, drank his coffee, sometimes ate a piece of toast, read whatever section of the newspaper was available. An ordinary errand in an ordinary life. He pulled into the small parking area beside the diner on a Tuesday morning in early November, turned off the engine, opened the door. He had been driving Route 30 his whole life, the same road that had taken James and Carol, the road Lily had slept on, coming home to Cedar Falls 4 years ago in the rain. He drove it without drama and without avoidance because there was only one road between the farmhouse and town, and he was not a man who made detours around difficult things. But today, pulling into the lot beside Paulette, he noticed something that made him stop. Across the parking area, at the edge of the lot adjacent to the hardware store, a man was talking to Gus Pollard, who owned the hardware, and who was a practical man of the kind who evaluated potential employees on the basis of whether they could do the work. The first man turned slightly. Preston Caldwell was 48 years old and had in the 3 weeks since Harold had last seen him changed in the way that some people change when the structure holding them upright is removed. He was standing straight enough, but the suit was gone. He wore a wool jacket, ordinary trousers, no tie. His hair was uncombed. He looked like a man making an effort to present himself and finding the effort more demanding than it used to be. He was appeared asking Gus Pollard about part-time work. Harold sat in his truck for a moment. Then he got out. He went into Paulette's. He ordered his coffee and he ordered a second cup to go. He did not deliberate over this. It was not a decision that required deliberation because it had already been made by everything Harold believed and everything he had tried to live, and all that was required now was to act on it. He took the 2 cups outside. Caldwell and Gus Pollard were still talking. As Harold crossed the lot toward them, Gus caught his eye, gave the uncertain look of a man unsure whether the approaching party is a complication, and then Caldwell turned. They looked at each other. Something moved through Caldwell's face. Recognition, a kind of bracing, and beneath it something raw, or the face of a man who has had 3 weeks to understand what he did, and who has not yet made his peace with it, and may not for a long time. Harold walked up and held out one of the coffee cups. Caldwell looked at the cup. He looked at Harold. Something shifted in his expression. Not relief, not gratitude exactly, but a kind of disorientation. The look of a man who has been prepared for something difficult and has been handed something he didn't expect instead. He took the cup. Harold nodded once at Gus Pollard, who nodded back with the quiet relief of a man who has watched a situation resolve without his participation. Then Harold turned and walked back toward Paulette's. He went inside, sat at the counter, drank his coffee. He did not look out the window to see what Caldwell did after, whether he stood there a long time or a short one, whether he said anything to Gus Pollard or went quiet, whether the coffee was still warm when he finally drank it. Harold had given what he had to give, and it was enough, and whatever Caldwell did with it was Caldwell's work to do. That was how it had to be. On the second Monday of November, Margaret filed the incorporation documents for the James and Carol Greer Foundation with the Iowa Secretary of State's office. The foundation's stated purpose was the provision of financial assistance, legal support, and advocacy services for grandparents and senior caregivers raising orphaned grandchildren in rural communities across the United States, with initial operations focused on Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas. There was no press release, no public announcement. Margaret sent a brief notification to 2 rural advocacy organizations she had identified as potential operational partners. The notification did not mention Harold Greer's name. It mentioned James Greer and Carol Greer. Harold had written that part himself at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening in late October, with Lily asleep upstairs and the house quiet around him. He had written it plainly, without ornamentation, with the care of someone who understands that the right words in the right order are their own kind of precision instrument. He wrote, "This foundation is established in memory of James Robert Greer and Carol Ann Greer, who believe that a family is made of people, not property, and that the most important thing a person can leave behind is the example of how they lived." He read it back once. He kept it exactly as it was. Lily found out about the foundation on a Wednesday evening in late November, almost 6 weeks after the morning at the bank. She found out because she asked. This was characteristic of her. She had the habit of waiting until she had assembled enough context to ask the right question, rather than asking prematurely and getting an answer that didn't address what she wanted to know. Harold had recognized this quality in her when she was very young, and had always respected it because it was a quality he shared. They were eating dinner soup, which Harold made every Wednesday from whatever was available, the particular soup changing by season and circumstance, but the Wednesday ritual of it constant. And Lily set down her spoon and said without preamble, "Grandpa, what's a foundation like a legal one that helps people?" He looked at her. "It's an organization," he said. "A person sets aside money and designates it for a specific purpose, helping people who need a particular kind of help." She considered this. "Did you start one?" "Yes." "What for?" Harold looked at his soup, then at his granddaughter, at the face that had her father's patience and her mother's careful attention, at the 8-year-old girl who had come to him in the rain 4 years ago and who was now sitting across a kitchen table asking him questions that deserved honest answers. "For grandparents," he said, "who are raising grandchildren alone. People who need help, legal help, financial help, and who don't have someone standing beside them when they need it." Lily was quiet. She picked up her spoon, looked at the soup. "Is it named for Mom and Dad?" she said. Harold looked at her for a long moment. She was not looking at him. She was looking at her soup bowl. Her small hands wrapped around the warmth of it, her face composed in the particular stillness she wore when she was working through something that mattered. "Yes," Harold said. She looked up then. Something moved through her face, not grief alone, because grief had its own specific weight, and she had been carrying it for 4 years and knew what it felt like. This was something else, something that sat alongside grief rather than inside it. Something that might, if he had to name it, have been closest to recognition, the look of a person who has just understood that the people they have lost are still in some way in the world. "Good," she said. She went back to her soup. Harold went back to his. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the November dark had settled over the fields. The lamp made its circle of light over the table. They finished dinner quietly, the way they finished most dinners, not from lack of things to say, but from the shared understanding that some moments don't require words, that presence itself is a form of communication between people who have learned to trust it. Harold drove to Minden, Nebraska on the last Saturday of November. He had not told Margaret he was going. He had not told Bertie. He had arranged for Lily to spend the day at Bertie's house, said only that he had an errand requiring some driving, which was true. He drove the 230 miles in his 2003 Ford F-15. Oh, the 187,000-mile truck with the rattle in the passenger door west on I-80 through the flat, wide country of a Nebraska winter morning. The fields were bare and pale, the sky enormous and gray, the road straight in the way that Midwestern roads are straight, not aggressively, not dramatically, but as a simple statement about the nature of flat land and the people who live their lives on it. He arrived in Minden at 11:30. He had the address from Margaret's files. He found the boarding house on the east side of town, a large two-story frame house, white with green trim, well kept in the way that houses are well kept by people who take seriously the responsibility of providing shelter to others. He parked in front. He sat in the truck for a moment. He had driven 230 miles without a complete plan, which was unusual for him, and he was honest enough with himself to recognize what that meant, that he was here because something required his presence in a way he couldn't fully articulate in advance, and that he trusted this recognition more than he would have trusted a carefully reasoned justification. He got out of the truck and knocked on the front door. The woman who answered was in her 60s, practical-looking, with the welcoming wariness of someone who runs a household that includes people navigating difficult circumstances. Harold explained that he was looking for Roscoe Pruitt. She looked at him for a moment, the assessment of a person who has learned to read strangers quickly, and said she would see if he was available. Harold waited on the porch. The man who came to the door was shorter than Harold, broader through the chest, with hands that were large, even by the standard of men who have worked with their hands all their lives. His hair was white, cut close. His face was deeply weathered, the specific weathering of Nebraska winters over decades. He moved with the awareness of a man who has learned to be precise about how he uses what remains, not slowly but deliberately, each movement purposeful. He looked at Harold with the measured assessment of someone who has learned that strangers showing up unexpectedly are not always what they first appear to be. In his right hand, Harold noticed he was holding a seed catalog, the kind that comes in the mail in November, full of possibilities for a spring that is still months away. The catalog was worn at the spine, certain pages turned down at the corners. A man who had been planning. "Mr. Pruitt," Harold said. "Yes," the man said. "My name is Harold Greer, Cedar Falls, Iowa." He paused. "I think you received some paperwork recently from an attorney in Des Moines." Something moved behind Roscoe Pruitt's eyes, not suspicion exactly, but the careful attention of a man who has been surprised before and has learned to wait before deciding what a surprise means. "I did," he said. "I sent it," Harold said. A long pause. The November wind moved along the porch cold and without ceremony. Down the street a dog barked twice and stopped. Somewhere inside the house a radio was playing quietly. Roscoe Pruitt looked at Harold for a long time. His eyes went to the worn boots, the canvas work pants, the flannel shirt visible above the coat collar. The same inventory Harold had been subjected to at the bank 3 weeks ago, but performed differently with different intent, the assessment of a man who is trying to understand something rather than dismiss it. He looked down at the seed catalog in his hand. "Eli's been going through this thing since the paperwork came in," he said. "He's got pages marked. Wheat varieties mostly, but also some vegetables he wants to try in the kitchen garden." He looked up at Harold. "He's 12. He's already got it all laid out in his head, what goes where, what needs what kind of soil." He drew a map. Harold said nothing. He let this settle. 30 years I farmed that ground," Roscoe said. "My father broke it before me. When they took it..." He stopped, looked at the catalog again. "I thought that was it. I thought that was the end of it." His voice was even controlled, the voice of a man who has had time to make his peace with hard things mostly. "Then the paperwork came, and my grandson showed me the map he drew." Harold looked at the seed catalog in Roscoe's hand. The worn spine, the dog-eared pages, the plans of a 12-year-old boy for ground that was coming back. "A 12-year-old with a plan," Harold said, "is a serious thing." Something moved through Roscoe Pruitt's face. Not a full smile, but the movement toward one, the slow softening of a face that has been set against difficulty for a long time and is remembering that it doesn't have to be set that way in every moment. "Yeah," he said. "He is." Harold extended his hand. Roscoe looked at it for a moment, then he took it. They shook the handshake of two old men who have worked with their hands for decades and who understand without discussion what that means about the kind of people they are. Roscoe held the grip for a moment longer than a standard handshake. "Why?" he said. The same question Caldwell had prepared to ask and had not gotten to ask. But from Roscoe Pruitt, it carried a different weight entirely, not the question of a man trying to understand a gesture of mercy from someone he had wronged, but the question of a man trying to understand why a stranger would drive 230 miles to stand on a porch in November and say nothing that couldn't have been said in a phone call. Harold thought about it. "Because someone should have been standing beside you when they sent you that letter," he said. "And I wasn't, and I can't fix that, but I can fix what I can fix." Roscoe Pruitt looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, once the slow, serious nod of a man who has received something and intends to keep it. "Good luck in the spring," Harold said. "Same to you," Roscoe said. Harold walked back to his truck. He turned on Route 6 and then picked up I-80 east 230 miles back to Cedar Falls, arriving after dark. He picked up Lily from Bertie's, thanked Bertie, and drove the quarter-mile home. Lily was tired. She leaned against the passenger window with her eyes half closed, the way she did on long days when the tiredness was good tiredness, the tiredness of a full day rather than a difficult one. "Good errand," she said. "Yes," Harold said. "Good errand." She closed her eyes. He drove the rest of the way home in the quiet dark, the stars hard and clear above the flat country, the familiar rattle in the passenger door keeping its usual time. The winter settled in properly by the first week of December. Harold continued to work fence repair, barn maintenance, the slow, careful work of keeping things in order against the cold. He helped Walt Briggs winterize a barn roof on a Thursday and Friday, charged fair rates, came home tired both evenings. He dropped Lily at school every morning at 7. He walked her to the entrance. She turned and waved before she went through the door. He picked her up at 4. They drove home in the early dark of December afternoons, and she told him about her day with the careful accuracy of a good witness, and he listened with his whole attention. They ate dinner together. She did her homework while he read beside her. At 8:30 she went upstairs. The house went quiet. This was their life. It had not changed. And that Harold had come to understand was the most important thing of all. Not that the world had changed around them, though it had in various ways, some still in process. Not that he had changed. He was who he had been because he was 72 years old and had arrived at himself through too much time and too much difficulty to be remade by a single extraordinary event, however extraordinary. What mattered was that the life he had built for Lily continued to be the life she could count on. The mornings kept their time. The oatmeal, the knock at 6:15, the drive to school, the single wave at the door. The evenings at the kitchen table, the lamp making its circle of light, a child working through her homework while her grandfather worked through a book beside her. This was what James had meant. This was what it looked like when you chose it every day, when you refused to let anything, not grief, not money, not the unkindness of strangers, not the sudden attention of a world that had never noticed you before, pull you away from what you had decided was worth protecting. The foundation received its first 32 applications by the end of November. Margaret managed the operational side from Des Moines. Harold reviewed the applications on evenings when Lily was asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the careful attention of a man reading about people whose situations he understood from the inside. He was not a man who needed to be visible in his generosity. What interested him was not the gesture, but the work itself, the specific patient, case-by-case work of identifying what someone needed and determining whether it could be provided. It was not unlike farming in this respect. It required attention to particulars. It required showing up. Harold was good at showing up. He had been good at it his whole life. In the spring, Roscoe Pruitt moved back to his 40 acres outside Minden with Eli, who planted what he had planned, and whose plans turned out to be sound. The wheat went in well, and the kitchen garden took hold, and by June the ground that had been gone was producing again. Harold learned this in a letter that arrived through Margaret's office in early summer. It was written in the careful handwriting of a man who does not write letters often but understands that some things should be committed to paper. He read it at the kitchen table on an evening when the windows were open to the warm Iowa night. The fields outside green and full in the particular way of June in this part of the country, not lush exactly, but abundant, the abundance of a landscape that gives what it gives without sentiment and expects you to work for the rest. He folded the letter along its creases and added it to the cedar box beneath the kitchen floor beside the land deed and the closing confirmation and Winifred Oak's letter and the document that had arrived from James's attorney the week after the accident. He stood for a moment with the floorboard in his hand before replacing it. 4 generations of this family had put things in this box. 4 generations of people who had worked this ground and kept what mattered and let go of what didn't and tried in the particular ways that ordinary people try to leave things slightly better than they found them. He replaced the floorboard. He went to the kitchen window and stood looking out at the summer evening. The green fields, the last light on the land, the enormous sky going slowly from gold to the particular deep blue that only exists over flat country at the end of a day in June. He heard footsteps on the stairs. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, 9 years old, now a birthday in April. The same dark eyes her father had, the same careful attention her mother had, and something that was entirely her own. Something that had developed in the 4 years he had raised her. A steadiness, a quiet willingness to meet things as they were, rather than as she wished they were, that Harold recognized as the most important quality a person could have, and that no one could give her. She had arrived at it herself, through everything she had been through, and it was hers. "Grandpa," she said. "Yes." "What are you looking at?" He looked out at the summer evening, at the green fields, at the wide, indifferent, beautiful sky over Cedar County, Iowa. He thought about James in the north pasture on an ordinary afternoon that had turned out to matter. He thought about a 12-year-old boy in Nebraska with a seed catalog and a map. He thought about a young woman in Des Moines sitting down at an audit desk on her first day and looking at numbers the way her father had taught her to look at them. He thought about an old man standing on a porch in November, holding the worn spine of a catalog full of plans for spring. He thought about what it meant to show up, to keep showing up, to choose every morning at 4:45 the life you have decided is worth choosing. "Just the fields," he said. Lily came and stood beside him at the window. She went on her toes to see over the sill. She was almost tall enough now not to need to, but not quite yet, and looked out at what he was looking at. The summer evening settled around them. The last of the light moved slowly across the fields, the way light moves across flat land at the end of a day, unhurried and without drama, taking its time. "It's pretty," she said. "Yes," Harold said. "It is." She dropped back onto her heels. She looked up at him with the face that had been a 4-year-old's face when he first brought her home in the rain and was now a 9-year-old's face and would keep becoming something else year by year for as long as he was there to see it. He put his hand on her shoulder. She leaned against his arm. They stood at the window together while the last of the summer light faded from the Iowa sky and the fields went from gold to gray, and the first stars appeared one by one in the darkening blue above Cedar County. The same stars that had been there above this ground in his grandfather's time and his father's time and his own. And that would go on, being there, patient and enormous and indifferent in the way that only beautiful things can be indifferent long after any of this was remembered. A man's worth is not what he owns. It is what he refuses to become.